Get started into our lesson in Ephesians. I'd like to go to the Father in prayer. And Jerry, would you mind leading us in prayer this morning?
Let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for this opportunity to gather here to study a portion of your word so that we can strengthen ourselves as your children, gain a better understanding of how we can live our lives here upon this earth. Help us to pay close attention to the things that we learn here, that we can apply them to our daily walk, so that we can strengthen ourselves, so that we can be an encouragement to those that we run into, and always are able to give a ready recollection of your written word and the hope that we have in you, Lord. We pray for opportunities, Lord, that we have to interact with folks that may not know you or your Son, that we can give them the information they need, and hopefully give them the opportunity to cling to you and to possibly be baptized, which is our hope, so that nobody's left behind. Father, we just continue to pray you be with us throughout this study, and you be with our members who are away, who are unable to make it today. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Okay, if you remember last week, we've been discussing the relationship in Ephesians chapter 5. We've been talking about righteousness. We've been talking about how what God expects from us because of the blessings he has blessed us with in the early portions of the book of Ephesians. And we've been discussing the relationship of the woman to the man to Jesus Christ, and the church as a whole, their relationship to Jesus Christ. And just go back and we'll read these previous verses before we talk about the question. So husbands ought to also love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church. And because we are members of his body. And we were talking about that marriage relationship and how that marriage relationship is kind of a pattern of the relationship between the church and Jesus Christ. That relationship between the husband and wife should pattern that same relationship between the church and Christ. And so we talked a little bit about all three of these questions last week. Is she willing to submit to me? Before marriage, I know before I got married, this was not discussed with me, but through this last three scriptures that we've talked about, or actually about 5 or 6 scriptures, is the woman going into that relationship, is she willing to submit to her husband? Is she willing to follow his lead and allow him to lead? To the husband, is he willing to lead? And provide for the family? Is he willing to place her needs above his? Is he able to treat her as a special gift from God and give her honor and respect? Or is he going into the relationship in a selfish manner on what she can provide for him? Is she going to satisfy his needs, and specifically in the sexual realm? Is she going to take care of him and spoil him? Women that a lot of times that are not willing to submit are spoiled. The husbands sometimes are spoiled. Mommy's taking care of everything for them, or in a woman's situation, daddy's taking care of things. And when they go into that relationship, and we'll talk a little bit later on, and I want you to stop and think about, if daddy has been guiding his daughter appropriately, she may have a hard time letting go of that. And Paul addresses that here in the next couple of verses. So those are some things to think about from a man's perspective, is he willing to lead? Is he willing to take care of his wife? Is he willing to sacrifice for her like Christ did for the church? Yes.
Like so many terms or words in the Bible, we don't appropriately understand them in reference to the Bible. I mean, here we say submit, but so much of society, or so much around us, the definition, the thought of the submission or submit is to kind of be like a slave or a person, like a low-level person in the military. Whoever's above you, they tell you to do anything without your input whatsoever, and you just say, yes, sir, and do it. You have no input the other way. And that's the way I think society, or so many people around, think of like the submit, is that the woman's supposed to be our helpmeet.
Exactly.
So we need to have her input to be our other half of the whole. If we only do our half without her input, her half, I think we're not following God's plan.
And we talked quite a bit at length earlier in this chapter about submit means willfully placing yourself under, allowing that person to take the lead. I was listening to a lectureship on marriage, and they said that a lot of times problems comes when the man does not take the lead, and the woman takes the lead, and the man takes the lazy position and lets the woman do all the work. And we're not fulfilling our responsibility as the man. So, and if you remember, the man is to submit to Christ, and the woman is to submit to the man as the man is submitting to Christ in the same way he submits to Christ. And when we make that commitment to go in as a Christian, we make that commitment to be baptized, to change our direction, to willfully place ourselves under godly direction. And in that same way, when we're thinking about marriage and we come together, the wife should be thinking about, am I willing to follow this man? Am I willing to allow him to lead? Am I willing to encourage him to lead? And so if we think about what are things that are evident in these 3 points, what if you looked at a marriage, what are you going to see when you see someone that's submitting, that's willing to lead, that's the man that's willing to sacrifice for his wife? What are some things that you will see? I mentioned some of them already, so I'll kind of give you an answer. A happy marriage. That is a very important point. A happy marriage. What else?
Well, God loves his wife in that triangle. You're always wanting to serve your wife, and your wife's always wanting to serve you, because that is serving. When both want to serve God, it just makes a perfect picture. You can never do enough for the other person, and they can never do enough for you. And so you don't want to do, you want to serve more and more. Whatever you want here, and she's like the same way towards me, and then, we want to follow God, and, it's a balance, and it's a perfect balance.
That's very true. And what I think you'll see is the husband giving honor and respect to his wife in the same way that he honors and respects Christ. That triangle. So, and some things that you'll see when this is broken down, we talked about some things earlier, the type of words that come out of the mouth. You know, they're not going to be edifying words. They're not going to be encouraging words. You're going to get into some of that where there's anger and dispute and that relationship's broken down. So I don't want to spend too long on this, John.
One of the benefits to marriage relationship God's way is, the world has got a lot of trouble. And when you come home, and if everything's going correctly, there's almost a sense of peace and comfort. You're coming home to a home, not a house. And if you're treating each other correctly, like I say, there's a peace to it. You don't get anywhere else.
Yep, you have a lot of peace will be seen there. When I think about some of the things that break this down, we stop and think about we have really a self-centered generation now in this world, in this society, and we're partly responsible for that. We can't conceive as men to be sacrificial one. And you notice here that in this previous scriptures, he didn't talk about work. He was talking about the relationship. And in this generation, the wife works, the husband works, and sometimes we use that to kind of justify maybe not getting along. Well, I had a hard day, or this happened at work and it's caused me stress. But a lot of men and women alike are worried about self, and that breaks down the role when we focus on self versus focusing on placing ourselves under Christ and placing ourselves under our husband and working together toward that common goal of being righteous in everything we do. So one of the things that Paul kind of summarizes here, if men knew how to be the head of their wives as Christ is the head of the church, women would happily submit themselves to their leadership. That's the original plan. And as we go into the next verse here, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So this original plan here is for us to be joined together. And when you're married, if the wife runs back to her husband or to her dad and says, "Dad, we're thinking about doing this. What do you think about that?" She's asking her dad instead of her husband. She hasn't really left her father and mother and joined herself to her husband. They haven't become one. They need to cut those ties the same way with the guy as well. If mommy has taken care of all of his laundry, taken care of all the cooking and everything, and spoiled her son, he's going to expect that same kind of treatment from his wife, and then you're going to have a breakdown. So they need to leave the parents, is what he's saying here. Leave the father and mother, join to the wife, to become one, and they need to begin relying on one another. So, and in order to be faithfully married, you notice, what does this say? That reason a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife. The man leaves, joined to his wife, talks about one man, one woman here, married for life. And I think that's important, because that's the picture that we have when we think about the model of Christ and the church. You know, marriage is a heavenly nature, and it reflects that union of Christ and his church. So within that basic framework of the church being in submission to Christ, the wife's attitude should be similar. The wife submits to her husband in all things. The husband needs to love his wife with that sacrificial love. And we talked about the different types of love last week. And that sacrificial love is also the same type of love that he loves himself with. So, any comments on when you leave your mother and father, and maybe some of the problems that some of you have experienced, or some of the things that you've gone through to help build that relationship? I know Scott?
I was just gonna say, when I first got married, I had certain expectations of the woman I married, not this one, but, well, I had expectations of her too, but part of it is, yeah. Just that we have expectations, and that it's unfortunate when you're young, that you don't necessarily, you just kind of get married and you expect certain things to happen. And when they don't, that blows up a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm. I get Jerry back here first, I think.
I think on, just reeling on that is that, it has a lot to do with how you're brought up. And as you're being raised, depending on what your dad and your mom did for you as a child, and what you perceive to be this is the standard way of, household runs. And then you get into that marriage situation, and some of those things that you expected or thought would be the norm may not be. And so those are the things that you certainly have to work through and identify that, is this something that I can live with without? So I think that the relationship or the rearing of yourself through adolescence up through adulthood as a later.
Before I get to you, I want to comment on what he's talking about. If you stop and think about, if you as a child, as you're coming up, if you're holding in a lot of animosity, or you're being treated badly by your parents, and they expect and you kind of revolt a little bit, and that leads to, and then you get in trouble for having anger, and then you kind of learn to hold that anger in, and you learn that because your parents maybe are being too hard on you, or they're expecting things that are really not proper. So you hold that in, and you hold that rage in, and then you come into a marriage relationship, and what Jerry is saying, I believe, is that comes out in there. The way you were brought up, and a lot of, if you were expected to hold those conflicts that you've had with your parents, or things that you thought you maybe could do that they didn't think you should do, or they expected way too much of you for your age, and they were demeaning to you, so that gets held in, and then that rage gets transformed or translated into your wife or your husband. So yes, I fully agree.
I think Jesus and God give us this perfect example of leadership and submission, to the point of they were one. They weren't divided, they were one.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, like when Jesus prayed in the garden, he gave input to God that if you can, if you can take this cup from me, please do it. So he gave his input. He was allowed to give input, but God made the final decision. relationship, if we don't allow the woman to have her input, we're wrong. Just
Exactly.
because she's in submission, that just means that when we make the final decision based on love and all these other factors, we're making the decision. But she still has her input, and so many, the stereotype is that the man is the boss,
Right. And
regardless of what the woman.
when we make that decision, if it's an incorrect decision, we should not go back and rail on our spouse because we made a bad decision. And more appropriately, if the wife was suggesting something different than what our final decision was, and she was right, we should come back and say we're sorry. If we're actually in a working, proper relationship. Kathy?
When I was pregnant with my first daughter, Reed's sister told me, she said, "You understand that baby doesn't belong to you." And I was like, I don't know where she was coming from. And I said, "Well, I understand, it's God's child." And she said, "No, he or she will be someone else's spouse and no longer belong to you. So you should start right now praying for the spouse of the child that's coming. And train your child to know whether they're going to be a good husband or good wife. And that stayed with me, throughout. But I think about that, it's like you train children to be Christian adults and have these attitudes from a small age.
That's true. Scott, you had a comment?
But what I was trying to say before, it's important we have role models, and it's important we know what our role is, and I think that's the part that's getting skewed nowadays. And not that the woman has to be barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, but at the same time, there are, the man has to be a man of honor and credibility and of his word, and, same with a woman, but, that's what we learn from the people that we see do that, and then we follow. And that's the importance, I think, of this whole thing, is as we're doing it, we role model that for other people, and there should be a norm around that, pretty much, or typical behavior. And that's what in society we're losing, because, to say, and it works to have a woman take care of the family, or a man to take care of the family, while the other one works. But we're too much about, well, we can't afford to do that, we need whatever. But, just the point being, good role models.
Good role models are very important, and one thing I've learned is we never know who's watching. Especially when you're working with teens or younger kids. They are watching. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later on. So the mystery is great, and I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. So if you think about, he's talking to father and mothers here, husband and wife, leaving their father and mother and becoming one. But then, wrong way. The mystery is great. I'm speaking with reference to Christ and the church. So he's talking about this model of marriage and reflecting that relationship between the church and Christ and the submission that we have within the church to Christ and the basic attitudes that we should have as a church when we come together. And when we're apart, we think about the relationship that we have and the unity we have in Christ, and what Christ has with his Father and the Spirit. So nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife, even as himself. and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. So, if we're gonna live that life, and this is really what we've been talking about, is that each individual is to love his own wife, even as himself, and the wife see to it that she respects her husband. Any comments up to this point? Because Paul has spoken to the husbands and the wives in a relationship with Christ, and now he's going to go to another part of that horizontal family relationship, and he's going to start talking to the children.
I know you mentioned, you asked what makes a good marriage, and also the analogy of Jesus, the head of the church, and then the husband, head of the household. I believe what else makes a happy marriage actually is forgiveness and repentance. Just as in the church, at the home, forgiveness and repentance is probably a very important part of a happy marriage.
Yep, I would agree. And then being able to say that I'm wrong, I've done wrong, and asking for forgiveness. So that's working together and working in a sacrificial way. So, and God doesn't talk about perfection here, but he talks about sacrifice. And he talks about placing yourself under. We know that we will never be perfect, that we all make mistakes and we all sin. But I think the key point here in all the marriage classes that I've been in, the number one thing for a husband is respect. And here God is putting that out, that the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. So we have to give respect. The wife needs to give respect to her husband. And we have to love our wives in a sacrificial way, just as we love ourselves. So any other comments? Okay. Let's go on to, so as I said, now the third part of the family unit, he begins speaking about the children in the family. So chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you, that you may live long on the earth. So now he's getting to that order in a family that requires the mother and father to maintain certain attitudes and rules, and that the children obey those rules. But you notice he didn't give any details here. He's talking about obedience. He's talking about kind of in the same way the husband and the wife's relationship, the children are to obey their parents just as we obey Christ. Honor your father and mother. And so Paul doesn't give any details about the role and obligations. And if you look back, somebody take and read Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. And this scripture here is a variation of Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12.
Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God has given you.
Okay, so honor your father and your mother. And that's basically what this is saying in verse 2, honor your father and mother. but he's talking about the land that they're going into in Exodus, to the promised land. And here, now that the Gentiles are part of the broader family, that they're included in the family of God, and they're not just the chosen Israelites that God's speaking to in the Old Testament. The obedience in the Old Testament was limited to the things that the Lord would require. You know, honor your father and mother, and things will go well with you in the land. Here, he's talking about to everyone, and not just to the Israelite. The obedience to the parents in Exodus, the promises that they would obey, that they would live a long life in the promised land. But here he's revising that so that it applies to everyone. We go on here to verse 4. It says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." Do you notice who does he address as not provoking the children? Huh? Okay, we know that. We see that very clearly. There's another point that Christy and I were discussing this week, that who does he address to bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord? Fathers. Fathers have a responsibility for bringing up the children. In our society today, when you were coming up, what did you see? What do you see in a lot of other people? Maybe even in your own house. Huh? Absent fathers. Exactly. Today, and one of the things I was reading this week was, stop and think about when you were in school, how many male teachers did you have? You had nuns? Okay. You had 2? I've taken my granddaughters to school, kindergarten, 1st, 2nd grade, and I know when my sons were in school, they had maybe 1 male teacher, and the rest were all females. My granddaughters, I don't think I've seen a male teacher in the school, period. And with the husbands being absent, the children going to school, they're missing their father's direction and teaching and discipline. And so if they come home and it's a single parent home and the mother is primarily raising the kids, they see mom at home, they go to school, they see women there. And there's nothing wrong. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying anything wrong about women, but God is addressing the men, and the men have been absent. The men have an important role to play in bringing up the children. And God says here, don't provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline of the Lord. So the command for children to obey is tempered with an appeal to fathers to use their authority in such a way as to not provoke their children to anger or to become discouraged. And the author of this outline that I'm using talks about children have feelings, and to provoke them to helpless anger is wrong. Instead, Paul says that fathers should raise their children according to the discipline and teachings of Christ. And that's a key part there, that fathers have to have an important role. Yes, Brent.
I did a study on this
Yep. Chrissy?
Usually, well, in the small town I grew up in, we had the principal was a man. And even in church, we have, there wasn't, I remember any men teaching like young,
In Bible classes? And we need to think about that as a church too, and we're teaching young kids and the youth, and what are they seeing? When they look at a couple in church, and there are a number of couples that I know have been married 50 to 60 years, and they've raised faithful children, and pay attention and talk to them, have some interaction with them, and find out how they did it and what they did. And I think you'll find out that they really raised their children. They brought them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. They taught them the importance of the relationship of the husband and wife. You think about in the Old Testament, the father and mother had ultimate discipline over the children. And today you don't, if in the Old Testament, if your children did something wrong, they could be taken out and stoned. And today, if children, get in trouble, they do something wrong, they're looking for a pass to get out of trouble. Or they'll threaten, well, I'll just go to DSHS, and I'll just leave the family and go out on my own. And society has allowed that. So part of don't provoke your children to anger and teaching them the right things, that goes a long ways. John?
Talking about the country itself, for the last 50, 100 years, maybe a little longer, our representatives had the order. They had the family, they had God, they believed in the Bible, and you can see where the society has progressed, where the majority of the representatives don't believe in God, they believe in themselves, self-empowered by themselves, and I think maybe one of the mistakes our founding fathers had, they didn't put that in. They didn't use the God-fearing man or women to follow the word and how the God was working on the day.
Yep, that is true. But I'll go back to what I said earlier. The problem lies a lot with us within the church, that we have fallen down on our job on following these principles to live by. So when you stop and think about, and it's been mentioned that the cardinal sin, I think, for today is the fathers have lost or they have given up their responsibility, and they've just pawned it all off on the women. They're not present, they're absent. So when you look at this, Paul kind of summarizes and concludes that for an orderly family, staying duty of the children is to obey, and that the fathers are to lead in raising the children. And it's contrary to that pattern we see today, but that's his guidance. So an ordered life includes an ordered family, and now he kind of moves into an ordered society. He gives some direction here. And the fourth requirement of righteousness is ordered living, and now Paul, he breaks it into two things. He's talked about the family, and now let's talk about the society. A righteous man or woman should strive to pattern his or her family after the order of Christ, what Christ has left as an example for us, what he's provided in his word, and also person will also strive to pattern his position in society according to the will of Christ as well. In these next few verses here, Paul will explain the responsibility of two positions within that current society, and that's really the era of masters and slaves. He'll show that regardless of one's position in society, a master or slave, a righteous person will conduct himself in the order that Christ has given. So we take a look at slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear, trembling, and in sincerity of heart as to Christ. So again, Paul is given direction here and details concerning the life and work of a slave. And there were various classes of slaves in the society then, but each class had a degree of responsibility. And so here we're going to see a key ingredient. Paul urges them to be obedient. Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters. And he required them to obey with knowledge that their masters were masters of their bodies and not of their souls. And we go on to 6:6, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. And so he instructs them, and a lot of times when we are at work, we think about, we don't stop and think about, we're actually given our jobs by God. We're actually working as if we were working for Christ. And he's talking about here, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves to Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. When we're working at our jobs, we are to do the will of God from the heart. We are to be demonstrating that Christian image, that Christian lifestyle, and obedience to Christ. And then in verses 7 and 8, with all good will render service to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. So here Paul is not defending, he's not promoting slavery. He simply gives those in a position the way to live, and in a way to please the Lord in everything that we do. And in so doing, when you stop and think about when we are pleasing the Lord and we're rendering service to the Lord, and we're not doing our work, we are doing it for the people we work for, but ultimately we're doing it as an example and in submission to God that he's given us our jobs. We'll finish up here. He addresses masters here. Masters do the same thing to them and give up threatening, knowing that both their masters and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality within. So he's comparing the masters there that were overseeing the slaves during this time, that even the masters had a master who was in heaven, and reminding them that our masters are in heaven, and there's no partiality with our master in heaven. So, yes.
That scripture before, I was just noticing, that seems to be, what I'm noticing, anyway, I don't know if anybody else already knows this, but it looks like that says, when we do good for God, we will receive back from the Lord. And, a lot of people say, oh, when we get to heaven, that's our reward, but
Stop and think about in the Old Testament when people obeyed God and did what God asked them to do. Did he bless them? Do we have a pattern of blessing throughout the Old Testament when they did good? When they didn't follow God's instruction, God allowed other countries, other peoples to come in and devastate God's people and draw them away. A lot of times we drew ourselves away by not following God's commands. But
I guess there's a time next to when you pray, and you pray for something you want, and then you kind of just accept that God's will whether you get it or not. And in this, it just seems, like I said, it's maybe my little, like, the opposite way. The fact that when you're doing good as a servant, you will receive back reward, like a direct correlation. It's not a question of will, he's going to ignore you or anything else, you're going to receive it. So like I said, maybe.
so, well, my time is up, and this is really kind of, we look at the obligations to the church. This is where we've been. We've looked at the unity that we need to have with one another, with the church to Christ, and we've really been looking at the different aspects of righteousness, having that loving attitude, life that's beyond reproach, piety, prudence, taking care of things. We looked at an ordered life in the family and in society. And now we're going to move into a new section next week, beginning in chapter 6, verse 10. And it's really talking about faith. So next week we'll pick up in chapter 6, verse 10. And if you have some comments, I know we kind of rushed through those last few verses on the master-slave relationship. Bring those next week, and there was quite a bit more discussion I wanted to have, but we kind of ran out of time on those last verses. So, okay, appreciate all the comments.